Tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon and welcome to our first webinar of 2022. I'm Vicky Watson, Chief Executive of the Aotearoa Circle. We've had 250 odd registrations today, so it's clearly a topic of interest. And whilst we have a number of key individuals online, I would like to acknowledge my current and past board members, Larissa Cooney, Simon Limmer, Izzy Fennick and Sir Chris Mace dialing in, and also Chair of Toitu Tahua, the Centre of Sustainable Finance, which of course was born out of the Circle's inaugural workstream, the Sustainable Finance Forum. So welcome, Bridget Coates. Today is focused very much on the practical application of the legal opinions completed by Nicola Swan and Daniel Kalderimis in 2019 to 2021. Those clarifying the duties of directors and trustees when considering climate change risks. Jess will put into the chat later the links to these opinions, which are all on our website, and also the very useful Directors Toolkit, which Nicola and Daniel also co-authored. If you have additional questions for the panel today, please can you enter them into the chat, but please be mindful that we have 1 hour and we might not be able to answer all of it. So welcome, thank you for your interest. Facilitating today will be Nicola Swan, partner at Chapman Tripp, and she leads their international law practice. She regularly advises listed companies, banks, insurers, and fund managers on climate risk and climate-related disclosures. Daniel Kalderimis is a highly respected disputes counsel and advocate who specialises in complex commercial and public law disputes. Both Nicola and Daniel are counsel for several of the defendants, including Fonterra in the Smith climate change litigation. Matt Whineray is Chief Executive of New Zealand Superfund and was one of our co-chairs in the Sustainable Finance Forum. Michelle Tsui is Trustee of Foundation North, also on the board of New Plymouth Perpetual Investment Fund and the New Zealand Super Nominating Committee. And Vic Crone, as many of us know, is Chief Executive of New Zealand Government's innovation agency, Callaghan Innovation, but is here with her director hat on. Sits on a number of boards, including Contact Energy Limited, and is chair of Statistics New Zealand Advisory Board. Thank you to all of you, and Nicola, over to you.
Thank you, Vicky. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's really wonderful to have so many of you joining us today for this really practical and important conversation as all of us grapple with climate risk management. Climate risk management has had a lot of focus in the last couple of years, and that was the context for the legal work that we've done and the two opinions that we've done for the Aotearoa Circle. But that important context is the passing of the climate disclosures legislation, which I know many of you joining will be practically grappling with as that comes into force for financial years starting from next year onwards. We've already got lots of those voluntary TCFD reports out, and they're getting more and more detailed, and that is reflecting the learning of many people in this community, which is brilliant to see. And we are leading the world on this. You know, New Zealand is the first country to have actually done it and actually brought through this mandatory legislation, and there are many coming hot on our heels. So we do have a bit of international focus to live up to. We've seen that Cabinet, the External Reporting Board, FMA, RBNZ, Ministry for the Environment, they're all on board. We've now got boards, GCs, CFOs, fund and investment managers, risk teams, sustainability managers, all of these different people within businesses increasingly talking to each other and sharing their different perspectives as to how to really do this climate risk management well. And that is really, really encouraging to see. And I think just looking at the attendees for today, it's this really wide group of people all coming together with these really important different perspectives that is actually going to help us get through some of the practical challenges of how we do this. What this means is that New Zealand is at the tip of an international wave of realization of how significant the climate challenge is, and businesses are really, because of this work, they are really focusing on how impactful climate change is going to be on their business. And so today, as Vicky said, is all about sharing that practical learning and that practical experience. And we welcome all of your thoughts coming into the chat. Daniel, I'm going to start with you. You've co-authored these two opinions with me now. What is the basic takeout sort of recap for directors, fund managers and trustees in a very practical context to better manage climate risk?
Thanks, Nicola. I think the basic takeout is that the law is in a state of flux, and so more than is usually the case, it's going to be the next decision coming out of the courts that's going to tell you exactly what duties look like rather than the last decision. So we're all in slightly uncharted territory. What our opinions make clear is that what isn't in flux is that there are duties. And those duties, whether you're a company director or a fund manager or a trustee, are to take into account material financial risks in the form of actual physical or transition risk caused by climate change that interacts with your business. And we're confident that through the various mechanisms in the Companies Act, the Trustees Act, whether it's through reasonable care duties, prudence duties, or the duty to act in the best interests of funds that you're in charge of, ultimately what the courts will require is that where climate change comes to be seen as material financial risk for your business or your beneficiaries, you have to take that into account. What is less clear is exactly by what benchmark or by what methodology or through what lens the courts will use to look at that. And so the main takeout, and this is a very timely webinar for exactly this reason, is that we need to think carefully and widely and practically about what that might look like, given that we don't have a 20-point decision with a list that tells us at the moment. And so what I think we're left with, and what I want to set up this conversation with this great panel to look at is this, that we know that when that list comes to be written, and it might be written and rewritten several times, it's going to be written in an atmosphere of heightened scrutiny with the rigor only increasing. And so what anyone who is in charge of important assets or making big decisions should be thinking is it's especially important to avoid fragile thinking, to avoid groupthink, to avoid specious accuracy that's tied too closely to assumptions and particular models that in a few years' time might look to have missed the point slightly or to have focused on things that don't seem as important to eyes in the future. And remember, it's always going to be a future court that's judging the reasonableness of what you're doing in the present. And so no one can really take too much comfort from being in the middle of the pack, because the risk here is that the whole pack moves quite quickly. And it was seen that everyone was in the middle of the pack, but on the wrong side of history. So that's the challenge, to try and be practical in the knowledge that this isn't something that you can just look up or take comfort exactly from what's going on around you.
Thanks, Daniel. That's very true that we are looking here at managing a risk which is so significant and which future generations are going to be looking back with very critical eyes. And this is something that is increasingly apparent, and so it's so critical for our business leaders to be thinking about it with that lens. Matt, I'm going to move to you as one of our leaders on this topic. The New Zealand Superfund has been integrating climate change into investment decisions since 2017. I'd love to hear from you what was easy and what has been hardest to do, and what you've learned from that process.
Kia ora, Nicola, and ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Before I jump into what was easy and hard for us, let me just say how important those legal opinions were. And it's sort of funny because if you distill them, what they essentially say is climate change is real, the impact is going to be material and foreseeable, and that engages the director's duties and the trustee's duties. But what we saw was the power of writing that down and in the very articulate way that Nicola and Daniel did was really important. Same as what we saw in Australia with the Hutley opinions, which have now been revised a few times as well, and really helped move this conversation along. But for us, what was easy and what was hard? Well, what was easy was categorizing it as an important risk. But I guess reflecting Daniel's point, it was less easy to then say, well, how does that impact the investment decisions that we're making? How does that impact on the portfolio construction? And so it took a bit to go through the construction of that climate change investment strategy. And what we did with that is break it into 4 bits: reduce, analyze, engage, and search. And worked under each of those with our investment teams and with the board. So it was probably a little harder to get the reduce bit approved. So we set some targets to reduce how we thought of climate risk in the portfolio as an unpriced risk. But we managed to do that with some stage targets. We started with 20% emissions intensity and 40% reserves. Why? Well, they seemed like reasonably chunky numbers. It was not a heck of a lot of science involved in that, but we knew that we needed to respond to that risk that was in there. And we've subsequently increased those to 40% emissions intensity and 80% in terms of our fossil fuel reserves ownership. The running that was both sort of simple and complicated. So we had to come up with some rules and principles for how we would recast our portfolio, and in particular our listed equities portfolio. And we've had a couple of goes at that, and I think that's one of the themes of this is, look, data is not as good as we'd like and is improving. Understanding of how these things interact and how the different transition and physical risks interact over different horizons for different sectors is all a little bit nascent as well, but we know the direction. So you'll have to just, sort of suck it and see with some of this, and you have to do it and try. And the same thing with the TCFD reporting as well when we get to that. So not so easy to get that done, but actually once we've turned the handle a few times, because we redo our portfolio each year, reset it to recast and consider, which takes into account what different companies have done in that portfolio in terms of their emissions, and also updates the data. Which helps us continue to refine that. It's getting easier to qualitatively assess the risks and opportunities, and there's lots more research and tools that have come to market and research providers. It's a little bit harder to sort of filter through those to say which ones are the ones that are actually important to the decisions that we're making. But there are still sectors where it's hard. So private market assets, that's hard. It's harder to get data. You're often using proxies for what the climate risk is with those assets, trying to proxy them with public market assets. Emerging markets is, again, a difficult area. It's harder to get the data out of that. And then finally, I would say that scenarios are hard, and that's a place where it's going to take us all a bit of time. Note the XRB's approach in terms of getting the different sectors to try and work together on those scenarios, which I think is critical, because it's challenging to get them to the level of detail where it's really useful to engage with the risk that a particular entity sees or a particular company sees. So yeah, a few easy things, a few hard things. That the harder things are becoming easier over time, and as we and continue to engage with our peers around the world and with our board, but it will just be a continued, I hate to use the word journey, we've had that ruined for us before, but it's going to be a continued journey.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of talk of the journey in this field, which I think is rightly so. You've been leading this work for some time now. Do you still feel that investors are pushing you to go further, and where are they pushing you to go further? How are they pushing you to go further, or do you feel like you're just skirting ahead of them in terms of that pressure?
I think there's lots of pushes coming. It's not just from investors, and so as I think about it, all of the Crown financial institutions at the end of last year received a letter from their respective ministers, which was a new letter of expectations around responsible investment, which was really focused on climate. It's quite a it's quite a useful read. It's quite short, but it sets out a framework for reducing, measuring, and influencing that sets expectations for the CFI. So pressure from our stakeholders, pressure from, or we're seeing activity from our asset managers, investment managers. See John Berry joined before. He is, and groups of investment managers out there are really sort of leading the charge. But you're also seeing pressure from consumers. Now we don't have direct customers. Our customers are all of the people of Aotearoa, but we did do quite a bit of work over the course of the last couple of years as we revised our responsible investment framework to produce a sustainable finance strategy, asking stakeholders what they were interested in seeing in that. And so you sort of get this pressure from many sides. You're seeing regulators, you mentioned regulators in your intro, stakeholders, customers, consumers, citizens of the country, and all of them are pushing really to be more active in taking these considerations into account in the investment decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So speaking of pressure coming up from investors, and in this case from beneficiaries, I'd like to turn to Michelle. Michelle, the most recent opinion that has sort of sparked today's conversation was the trustee opinion that we released earlier this year. And there we were saying that trustees' duties to invest prudently and for the best interests of beneficiaries, and really importantly, the duties to act impartially between beneficiaries, particularly over the longer term, all align in terms of supporting management of climate risk. And Foundation North, for whom you are a trustee, holds a really significant endowment and trust for the Auckland and Northland communities. And you've already got multiple drivers in your strategic plan. So there's the regenerative environment driver alongside equity and social inclusion. And we're seeing that all of this is coming together more and more. And Foundation North is targeting already the transition of its investments to achieve a net zero portfolio by 2050. So similar thoughts to what the Superfund has been doing. Can you tell us sort of why and how the board arrived at this decision and the sort of insights you've seen as that process has unfolded for others on the seminar today who are, thinking of going down a similar path and wondering how best to do it?
Kia ora, thank you, Nicola. So the way we thought is that setting a net zero target is really part of Foundation North's responsible investment journey. We have included environmental factors in our investment considerations for many years, although quite not explicitly, but we feel that we're at the juncture where we need to put a stake in the ground. Our thinking and investment behaviour actually around environmental factors as part of our responsible investment framework actually evolved over time. So maybe I can share with you some of the key points of our journey. So I guess firstly, what is the purpose of Foundation North? Our purpose is very clear and it's also set out in the trustee. We are to hold the funds in perpetuity for the benefits of the people in Taitokoro Northland and Tamakimokoro Auckland. So it's clear we are investing for generations to come, and very clear who are our beneficiaries. And it's just common sense that we do need to minimize our investments' environmental impact, and where we can actually help the community build resilience against environmental factors. As you might remember, Northland has suffered droughts and floods in recent years, reflection of climate change. There's a high percentage of Māori living in Northland, and they've aspirations that are linked to the whenua. So it does just make sense for us to take environmental factors and climate change into account when we invest. So I did dig back into our history of how we started thinking about ethical investing. Interestingly, that was pre-GFC, and it was due to reputation risk. The question was, are we actually investing in something that's unethical? And so that prompted sort of regular reporting in that area. And so what got reported got noticed, and over time the trustees' views broadened in 2008, and we signed up to the UNPRI. And that's where Foundation North started to more consciously incorporate ESG factors into our investing. And with the help of our investment advisors, then the portfolio gradually transformed. We were when we look for managers, we look for managers who invest more sustainably. So that's in the E and S and the governance area. And again, that how are we doing in terms of relative to the UNPRI, that got reported. And so that sort of highlight all that for our trustees, and there's more focus on it. Okay. So why are we setting a net zero target now? The board reviewed our responsible investment policy last year. The legal opinion was considered, and also at the same time we had revised our trustee in the last year as well. And in our trustee, the two things is, one is that to exercise our duties, we have to take tatility, the principle of tatility into account when we exercise our duties. Secondly, it's actually written in our trustees that when we consider investment, we're able to take into account the environmental, social, and governance issues into account when we make our investment decisions. There was a very strong view around the table that climate change issues need to be urgently addressed, and just having a zero target is a natural progression for us. We actually had a very interesting discussions on whether we should target net zero before 2050 and make it more aggressive, and whether we should just divest fully from fossil fuel investments. So in the end, it was the practicality of how to decarbonize, and recognizing a lot of the technology may not be around now to help with decarbonization that sort of hold us back, and also that recognizing that some of the fossil fuel companies are actually needed for a sustainable transition in climate change. So that's where we sort of maintain the 2050 target. But again, as things progress, that doesn't stop us looking at that target again and be more aggressive. And we are at the start of our net zero journey. We still have to put a bit more science into what we're trying to do. We need to set the milestones, and I'm sure there will be lots of learning, and we will be happy to report back.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. It's really great to just hear someone who's done it and who's been doing it for such a long time, and that is really worth recalling, that this is something that, particularly from the iwi perspective, it's something that is obvious and has been done for some time, and we shouldn't forget that and think that this is all new. I mean, Foundation North, just to say with you for a moment, operates in different areas. So the organisation, the granting program, and then the investment. And I'd be interested in how you manage climate change risk across those different areas, because that is the case for many listening. They are looking at how do they manage climate risk across different parts of their business, which are often very disparate and potentially unconnected.
So climate change actually intersects and cuts across all our activities. As you mentioned earlier, I mean, our vision is to enhance life. And two of our focus areas are addressing inequality and regenerative environment. So for many years, we've supported the Hauraki Gulf restoration and work on projects such as reconnecting Northland and working with the Sustainable Business Network. We know that the people who are disadvantaged today in society are much more vulnerable under climate change, simply because they don't have the means to adapt to it. So climate action is urgently required, and as such, we have signed up to the funders' commitment to climate action. So this is a 7-part commitment, and is guided by Te Tiriti o Waitangi and Matarangi Māori aspirations, and it focuses on a just transition, collaboration, and leadership. So very significantly includes reporting back to our communities and the stakeholders the action that the signatories have taken, including the decarbonisation of the investment portfolios. And the Community Trust has set up a climate change working group, and it aims to explore all the different ways of working together on climate change issues. I'd like to acknowledge the mahi that's ongoing, and in particular Trust Waikato and Bays Trust, who have been very generous in sharing with us their knowledge and learnings. So if I can just take just transition example, there are actually many ways that we could look at achieving that outcome. We could work on providing a grant to an organisation to install solar panels, or we could support a company that provide affordable solar panels to vulnerable communities through an investment. Or we could actually share our climate transition knowledge to communities to assist them in finding their own solutions. So those are sort of across the different activities, and there are so many different ways to support them. So one of the newer tools that we have is through investment. So Foundation North, actually we launched a impact investment fund last year. And this is what we called Impact First and Finance Second, with the majority of the fund invested in, to be invested in Northland and Auckland. So we do envisage investment opportunities where there are iwi-led initiatives, and do believe that a lot of them could possibly lead to sort of climate change mitigation or solutions. And I guess the way I think about it is that, look, with every sort of change, there are opportunities, and it's keeping an open mind and looking outside of your framework to see, hey, what can we try and what could work? And I think that will help with developing an ecosystem to support climate mitigation.
Yeah, that is a really useful point to remember, that the opportunity in this is something we shouldn't forget, and I think we should think about that at a New Zealand level as well. And on that note, I want to bring Vic Crone into the conversation. Vic, as Vicky said, the CEO of Callaghan Innovation, as well as holding the independent non-executive director role at Contact and her role at NZ, at Stats NZ. Vic, lots of people have been working hard, particularly within Contact, on TCFD, climate risk reporting. Contact was the first NZ company to officially sign up as a supporter of TCFD once those international recommendations came through. What have you learned from your perspective within Contact? Similar to question to Matt, and this is the one that everyone finds interesting, what's been the most difficult? And how, I guess, has the work that you've done specifically under the TCFD climate risk reporting lens, how has that lined up with other work that you've had underway within Contact already, in the same way that Foundation North has had work underway for some time in this area?
Kia ora koutou, no mai, haere mai. Lovely to see everybody. Thank you for that really great question. I think yeah, we've had a lot of work underway for quite a while, and the place that I would actually start is to say climate sustainability needs to be embedded deep into your strategy. And so we evolved our strategy a wee while ago, and we deeply embedded it in that. It's, you know, relatively easy in the energy industry to see where we need to go in regards to, you know, the final 15% or so of clean energy that needs to be developed and delivered for New Zealand. So that would be number one, is to embed it in your strategy. Number two is really then starting to think about, as Matt talked about earlier, how your investment strategy flows from that. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, for directors and for New Zealand companies, is the level of investment that is going to be required to decarbonise your organisation to meet the targets is significant. And so understanding that, modelling that over, you know, a 10, 15, 20-year time period has been really important as well. We've been looking internationally at reporting on climate change for quite a while now. And then, of course, with international shareholders, it makes it a lot easier because there's a lot of pressure coming through from our shareholders in regards to what we're doing in this space. And so it was quite natural for us to then step into TCFD. I mean, if you hadn't been doing that, then I think it's a lot of work, and I think that would be some of the learnings that we've had. First of all, is that don't underestimate the data collection in terms of actually understanding all of your emissions. And then measuring all of them. And then, of course, the importance of assuring that measurement. So I think don't underestimate that. And then two, setting targets is not necessarily as easy as it sounds. So actually getting some good data measurement under your belt for a wee while before you can set targets that are, you know, relevant, achievable, and therefore you can be meeting as well. So I think that's another big learning for us as well. I think with the financial reporting obligations coming through, the other thing I'd really be encouraging directors to be thinking about is not just viewing it from a risk management lens, because that is really important, and it's always a very good way for boards to take action is to understand risk. So definitely use the risk management lens. It is important. But I think what is also important is to consider your reputation. And we all know the kind of world that we live in with social media and media. And so in terms of that reporting, which covers governance and how you're thinking about it, how it's embedded into your strategy and all your planning, right through to your risk management and then your metrics and targets, you know, just really think about when that comes an obligation, you know, how is the media going to react to that? How are your customers going to react to that? So really considering that reputational index or angle of the reporting, I think is really important across a wide range of stakeholders. And then the final thing I'd say, just kind of picking up on what Michelle was saying, is, you know, I think, I mean, I notice a really big difference in terms of often how I hear climate talked about around the board table with how my children talk about it. My children are 17 and 21, and how they're thinking about their lives, God forbid that early, and all the things that they need to be thinking about, and the prominence of climate in it. So I think for directors to be able to kind of visualize for our kids, what is it going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years? And it's a pretty horrific picture if you really do take some energy to kind of think about the potentiality of all the bad things that could happen. And then therefore it becomes not a risk management director lens or a financial management. It becomes about, you know, as Michelle said, you know, our mokopuna and how we are, you know, protecting and the relationship we have with everything around us, which I love the Maori way of thinking. They don't treat them as assets or functional objects. You know, it's the relationship we have, and how we need to treasure that and guard that and protect that moving forward. So I'd always encourage directors to bring, you know, your kids and your grandchildren's lens in to be thinking about this as well, to make it a bit more, dare I say, emotional and personal.
Yeah, and I'd love to just jump quickly to Daniel here on that one, because that emotional personal connection is something that actually really mattered when we were considering the legal risk analysis, when we were doing the director's opinion. Daniel, do you want to jump in and comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's quite right. Sort of at the core of what we think about when we think about the legal risk, the decision makers actually doing exactly what Vic was describing, trying to imagine what this is going to mean for their children and their grandchildren, and turning that felt sense into a sense of justice or injustice, and then informing their meaning of what these legal standards of reasonableness really are in this context. And so when you sort of look ahead, that's what I think you are thinking about. You are thinking about the fact that future judges are going to be living in a different world than the one we're living in, and you're trying to calibrate what you're doing and how fast you're doing it against the sense that that different world might come faster than you think.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Vic, maybe just staying with you for a moment, the other hat that you're wearing today is from your role at Callaghan Institute. How do we position New Zealand then as a leader on all of this work and thinking that's happening, and perhaps happening just in a public way, slightly more quicker than other countries? Where is Callaghan Institute focusing on climate mitigation, energy transition, etc. At the moment?
Absolutely. So I think, we did a clean tech report, which we released last year. So that's on our website, and it looked at a whole wide range of industries and benchmarked us globally in regards to our innovation ecosystem and how that's performing. And what that showed is that we have an opportunity to be a global thought leader. We are a global thought leader on this already, and there's a couple of reasons why. Obviously, our clean energy, compared to many countries internationally that are only sitting around 30, 40, 50%, we're right up there. And then actually our Te Ao Māori Indigenous thinking, which is really integrated into the environment. And so, there's and our agriculture industry is doing some good stuff in the clean tech space. So I think we've got some good foundations. However, when you look at the pace that we're going and the investment that we have in our clean tech innovative companies, we are lagging behind significantly. So we got a lot of really, really promising clean tech entrepreneurs out there. And I guess my message into this audience is to, go have a little look at that report. If you're not aware of the innovation ecosystem in regards to clean tech around your industry, between the report and scaleup.nz, you can go and see where all these companies are emerging. And there's a lot of work going on in all sorts, Internet of Things and sensors, big data, and recycling materials and housing and construction, you name it, there's a lot going on. And map out, ask your management teams to map out the ecosystems for clean tech in your industry, so that you can start to see where the opportunities are for either investment opportunities, for joint ventures, for partnerships, and the like. And so, we do need our larger organizations really supporting our clean tech industry. And instead of what we can want to do is to go it alone as large organizations, is actually to get in there to partner, to recognize we can't do all of this ourselves, to build clusters across your industries, and to get out there and invest and partner in these startups. So that would kind of be my message to directors, is, as part of your obligations is to really ensure that you understand where technology and innovation can take and really help you reduce emissions in your industry, because there's a phenomenal amount of it going on.
Yeah, brilliant. That is a really useful call out, Vic. Thank you. Heading back just into the actual disclosures that are driving some of this really, really great work. Matt, you've set targets for the fund that you were talking about before, and there's a couple of questions coming through the chat that I thought would be useful to bring in here. I was going to ask you about what the hardest parts are you think of that new scheme, and you mentioned scenario analysis before, and I'd be interested in hearing thoughts on why that's hard and how you're sort of working through it. But aligned with that, one of the questions coming through the chat is what's preventing entities from actually adopting these science-based targets, and how do we move towards encouraging that and encouraging really credible targets, because that's something you've done a lot of thinking on within the Superfund.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. One thing I would say, just in the comment in terms of Vic's comments and Daniel's, I think I agree with that construct of the lens, because I think that hindsight is going to be particularly cruel in this space, and that when Daniel and Nicola are standing in court in years hence, people will be going, what were you thinking? And how could you possibly have not seen this? So I think that is a really useful lens to try and picture this out of others' eyes. In terms of hardest parts, Well, for us as an asset owner, for us to be able to prepare the types of disclosures you need under the TCFD, we need data. So that's what Vic was talking about before. We need good quality data, disclosure from our external managers. We need it from our portfolio companies. We need it from some of those private assets, which is harder. That is everybody's working on that, and that is improving. But I would just reiterate the point that Vic was making, which is this doesn't start, although it's called TCFD and everyone focuses on the D, the disclosure. This is not about disclosure. This is about how do you manage climate change risk in your business. And so the four categories in the TCFD are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And there's a reason metrics and targets is last. It's because you can't do any of that. You can't set those until you've actually addressed the first three. You've decided who's going to own the risk, how is it integrated into the strategic decisions the entity's making, and into your your risk management framework. And so until you've done those, you can't actually write a TCFD report. And that's what we've discovered as we've gone through this. So we've been sort of learning by doing. We produced our first one a couple of years ago, produced a second one last year, and we're trying to fit our climate change investment strategy into that TCFD construct, and that's still coming. So in terms of the hardest parts, just getting that data. The scenario point is an interesting one, because for us as an asset owner, scenarios are harder. At an industry level, the company does a scenario thinking about what's the impact of transition and physical risks on their business and on the environment they're in. As an asset owner, that's a little bit harder. How do we do that at a global level? I don't think we've figured that out yet, frankly. But you can see why the XRB is going to look to get coordination across industries to try and produce those scenarios at an industry level. So you get some meaningful disclosure out of it. It sort of means something. What's preventing entities from adopting science-based targets? Well, I think working through that TCFD sort of construct. There's a great piece of work. Here's a shout out for Chapman Tripp that you did last year, the TCFD primer. And what's interesting about that is it's not until you get to step 7 in that you're actually considering metrics. You're thinking about metrics. Right back at the start, you're thinking about, well, how does this impact our business? What impacts is that having on our strategy? And you work all the way through before you start thinking about how do we set metrics and targets. So I think probably what's, a lot of the time where we have these conversations, it's often CFOs, because CFOs have to do the disclosure. And so they've been handed this stuff. It's like, oh, well, you're going to do the TCFD disclosure because now we have to do that. But it's not about the CFO, it's about the strategy. It's about the board engaging with it. So that's one of the things that prevents that happening is it's got to be owned first of all at the governance level, and how does the business respond to it?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Matt. And on the scenarios, I agree with you. For the fund managers, trying to get your hands around a sensible scenario is just so hard. Yeah. And I guess useful for people on this call who are thinking about putting together scenarios, help them identify their risks, to help them test the resilience of their management of those risks. It's not just thinking about a 1.5 degree physical scenario or 3 degree, physical scenario. There's a lot to be said for thinking about a scenario where New Zealand and the world for international customers has an orderly transition towards net zero versus a disorderly transition. And some of the key scenarios really divide between those two worlds, where you have clear regulatory signals about what you're going to need to do and a gradual rise in ETS carbon prices, versus the scenario where there are really quick, unexpected decisions from governments that cause a whole lot of cost. And it's the counterfactual of where you might sit if that is the way it falls out. That is the financial piece that it's really useful to think about and understand. So yeah. Less investment now for less cost later.
Before we published our climate change, or actually developed it, we did a bit of work with other investors where we got Mercer to do some work for investors and asset owners around the world. And what they did was take 4 potential climate risks. So they, like all good consultants, came up with an acronym that was Tripp, which I think stands for transition, resource impact, P is physical, and I forget what the I was. But effectively, they are essentially transition and physical risk, but broken into 4. And then they thought about what the impact of those was on different industries and different asset classes, and over different timeframes and under different pathways. Because that's one of the problems here. We don't know what the destination is. And because we don't know what the destination is, don't know what the pathway is. Do we get there by having a severe rise and a big regulatory impost, or a much more gradual rise because we've got a better regulatory response? And that produced a bunch of outputs for us as an investor, which was really helpful in developing it, because what it said was, under all of those different pathways, developed market equities are going to do poorly as a result of these things relative to some sort of base case or status quo. So there is some. So that's on our website. It's a report by Mercer. It's called "Investing in a Time of Change." I think that was the title. So that's a way you can do some of that scenario for an investment manager, but it's a big job.
Yeah, that's it. This is all big, and it's going to take people and time and cost, and actually freeing up those resources within the organisation is one of the best things that can happen from that top-down perspective, so that people have room to actually think through this. Vic, one more specific question for you, and then I'm going to come back to Daniel to sort of look ahead in terms of pressure in this area. Vic, something that comes up a lot with some of the clients I work with is, how do you reconcile what might otherwise be relatively sensitive business strategy looking forward, that you might not usually disclose in such a public way, with the expectation of the TCFD disclosures that they're going to require these forward-facing disclosures about what you're going to do? How do you talk about your strategy in a really meaningful sense, while not giving away everything? You may not have I don't think there's no one full answer to this, but really interested in your thoughts as to how you've grappled with that.
Yeah, I think if climate sustainability and even kind of heading into the kind of well-being space, because I think that's the inclusion and the likes that Michelle kind of is touching on, I think is going to come pretty quickly in the next decade after that. But anyway, so I think if you embed it in your strategy, then you talk about it via your strategic lens. And so, Contact Energy is, wants to be the leader in decarbonisation, and therefore it becomes very, very natural for us to want to talk about it, to want to share what we're doing, to update progress. And I think, to the point earlier around how we work together as industries, and in New Zealand, often we can be, very, very competitive with each other and forget that actually, huge amounts of opportunity influencing is happening offshore. And so how do we garner together to work with that and play our role there? And so encouraging industries to collaborate. And so, there's a lot of collaboration happening in the energy industry around how we decarbonise the last part of it, and particularly the fast start energy that we need. So discussions, around hydrogen and the like, around what we do with TCC, but also with Huntley and things like that. And so I think it's permissioning yourself to use your strategic lens, to have a very strong integration of climate into that, because it's the right thing to do. And then it becomes a lot easier to talk about it. And then just recognizing that, particularly this climate challenge is bigger than any one of us individually. And so, it's only in our coming together, not just in New Zealand, but, around the world, that we're actually going to be able to make any headway in this and have a better planet for our children's future. So they would be some of the ways, and therefore just worrying a little bit less about some of the traditional ways where we've, really guarded some of the information. I think this is not the place to guard it. Unless you're not ready, and then get ready really, really fast, as to the conversation around Matt and Daniel from them.
Yeah, very good advice. Get ready. There's been a couple of questions coming through the chat. Thank you for these questions. I'm bringing them in as much as I can. One of them is around, how do we define material climate-related risk? We talk a lot about it, but what actually is it? And to those people, the XRB is looking in depth on this, and I'm expecting that there'll be some discussion of this, and potentially something useful in terms of materials in the next round of their consultation, which is coming out mid-March on the climate standard that they're developing. But the quick sort of answer, I guess, is that it's different for every business. And for example, in some businesses, consumer shifts in Europe, around food miles, etc., that might constitute a material risk for a particular export business, while for others, the ETS cost in New Zealand might be material. For others, that ETS impact will be immaterial because it's not affecting their particular business, but a particular regulatory change about transport policy might be material. So the difficulty is you need to understand the qualitative and quantitative impacts for the particular business to understand which ones are going to be the material ones. And sometimes that's been surprising. Everyone seems to gravitate to the physical risks having a material impact. But what we're understanding better, I think, is that it's the regulatory and transition risks which are actually going to have a material impact earlier. And that, I think, is catching people by surprise as they work through this. So Daniel, really welcome your comments on that. And where we're likely to see the most effective pressure in New Zealand looking ahead. And the questions often, is this going to be coming from shareholders and investors, from media, reputation, or the courts, all of which we've touched on today.
Thanks, Nicola. I don't have anything to add to that answer. I think that is exactly the answer. Unfortunately, it's necessarily context dependent in terms of what's a material risk. In terms of where's the pressure going to come from? I don't think any of our crystal balls are sufficiently finely calibrated to really tell. I think what we can say is that there's a sort of self-reinforcing system that gets to work in these types of situations. So whether it's shareholder pressure that leads to a groundbreaking court decision that then leads to increased media exposure that then feeds something, or whether it's a court decision that leads to media exposure that then catalyzes shareholder action, one doesn't know, but probably it doesn't really matter which way the circle works. I think what really does matter is some of the themes that you've heard, especially from what Vic was saying, and about climate change being embedded deeply into your strategy, or Michelle's comment about the need to really think about the reputation risk. Because I think when you get to argue these sorts of cases out in court, you'll be able to see a dividing line between narratives that position the company as greenwashing or self-serving or half-hearted or ineffectual, and those that are seen as genuine and meaningful and sustained and effective. And what you're trying to do, I think, is to really write your own story now. Write it in a way that is true now and will stay true, even in the cruel lens of hindsight that Matt, I think, quite rightly says is coming. And the thing that Matt said that really resonated with me, and is perhaps the most important thought that I have about this, is the big unknown in the future, but it is something to think about, is the idea of a sort of transition acceleration. Because you have tipping points in these types of things, and you see it with protests at the moment, with how we deal with COVID, that you can go quite quickly from a situation where everything seems sort of under control to a situation where people seem to panic. And when people seem to panic, you can't trust the institutions in quite the same way as you could before, because they will do more radical and far-reaching things in a bid to get quickly on top of a problem. So over the next few years, as we look to see how well climate change is being dealt with, it looks like it's not being dealt with very well. I think you can anticipate some shocks along the way.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. It's pretty sobering. We are coming up to the end. I'm just going to summarize quick fire some of the best ideas I've heard in the last 50 minutes, especially for those who've joined late. Before I do that, Michelle, Vic, Matt, is there a one bullet point thought you'd like to leave us with? I'll go to Vic first.
Gosh, I think, yeah, I mean, I think, for me, it's around that really genuine authenticity kind of connection, strategic link. And if you haven't nailed that, then really focusing on nailing that. And if you have, everything will fall from that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Vic. Michelle.
Yeah, I think follow on from Daniel, it's doesn't matter what organisation, you need to look at your context and the purpose. Okay. And really, I'd like to leave the world a better place than when I came.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. There's some wonderful comments in the chat around that perspective and asking what are we doing in terms of how we'll be judged in the future, and are we comfortable with what we're doing now? Matt.
Yeah, I'm focused a little bit more on how to help some of the practical questions in here. And I was just having a quick squiz at whether we'd published our valuation framework. And to Vic's point earlier, there's a lot of this stuff where this information is just not a proprietary competitive thing. This, other people having that valuation framework doesn't diminish our response from a climate change perspective. So I just want to check that, because I'm certainly happy to publish it and might help with some of that discussion around, well, what is a material climate related financial risk? And your point about context. And that's hard because people go, well, it sort of feels like that's a bit of a mushy answer because you just told me that it sort of depends. But actually there is a way, and we've done it, it's not the only way, there's plenty of other ways, but the way that we've had a crack at trying to break that down by the different risks and then be a little bit more explicit underneath that about how that's going to impact. But also overlays things like consumer demand and liability, obviously close to your hearts, that last one, which is, the litigation impact on these companies, but also change in consumer preferences. That happens, we have seen, a lot faster than regulatory change. So you can suddenly find you're on the wrong side of that real quick. So actually, I'll just go back and check that, because I'd be very happy to publish it and just provide that so that people can use that from a practical perspective.
Hey, that sounds wonderful, Matt. Thank you. There are lots of people online now who are saying thank you, Matt. So look, quick summary, especially those who've joined. Start now, assume your plans will change, set some targets, assume the targets will change, get really good data so that you can set better targets that you've got some confidence in. Use some of the existing risk management that you've already got in place. So risk registers, risk planning, use that to help, don't reinvent the wheel. Get good advice on the research and data, and particularly as that's changing and getting better really quickly. Some of the products that are coming onto the market are really helpful. Talk within the sector that you're in, see if you can share anything within the sector. Scan the market for what others have done, because all the time there are new examples of how to do this stuff well, particularly on the governance risk management side. A lot of that, you can see what's happening out there in the market and use it. Consider Matauranga Māori, look at what we can learn, particularly in New Zealand, because that is so embedded in the way we do things anyway that the rest of the world isn't perhaps as quick off the mark on. Vic's point, embed the climate risk management deeply into your strategy so that those forward-looking disclosures are a really positive story rather than something that you're concerned about disclosing. Model the investment required, Matt's point, and then think about the counterfactual, so the cost if you don't do the investment now, even if the investment now seems a lot. And again, coming back to not underestimating the data that is needed to do this well on the quantitative side, but thinking qualitative too. One other practical thought I have is that Infins, a shout out for Infins, is doing a masterclass on climate reporting soon. So that's on their website. And it's going to cover a lot of this stuff in detail for those who are thinking about needing to get into this. So Vicky, I am going to hand back to you with a minute or two to spare, just to say a huge thank you to the time from this wonderful group of people we've had with us.
Oh, look, thank you, Nicola, and thank you to Daniel, Matt, Michelle and Vic. An outstanding webinar, very practical examples, and I think everyone will go away with a little bit better information and armed on how they might approach this. We will be releasing the recording of this so that you can pass it on to others in your organizations. But thank you so much to everybody, particularly Chapman and Tripp, from your original work on the legal opinions. I think we've truly sort of lived them today and better understanding the duties and responsibilities. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Vicky.
Cool. Thanks, Tim.